Oops. So, hello everyone, and welcome to our event on this, the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty. We've called our event Poverty and the Bomb, both issues which are massively high profile right now. I'm Marion Pallister, Chair of Pax Christi Scotland, and I'm most grateful to our distinguished speakers and to all of you who are joining us from all around our common home. It's our custom to open these online events with a short reflection and prayer. And I'm very, very pleased today to be able to welcome Pax Christi Scotland member Anne Dobbing, who is going to take on that task. So I'm going to hand over to you now, Anne.
Thank you, Marion. Excuse me. The other day, I saw a segment of news on the television about the war in Ukraine. For a split second, as part of the video images, I caught a glimpse of a soldier clearly gravely wounded, unable to stand, lying alone in a muddy trench. He lifted his arm and made the sign of the cross. It caught my eye that he used the Orthodox Christian way of touching his right shoulder before the left. The image barely lasted a second on the screen, but its memory has lasted in my mind. Was he a young Russian conscript? Or was he a Ukrainian defending his home against invasion? Where did he come from? I wondered if he died in that place after that gesture of faith in a place of horror. Whoever he was in that muddy trench, he reached out to God. I wonder if he was someone who prayed every day, or was he someone who, having ignored God in his life up to that point, suddenly in lonely desperation reached out for help? Whatever the answers to those questions, full of fear at that moment, he made one last gesture of trust and faith. In the end, labels of nationality and religion are irrelevant because we are all human people. If we are cut, we bleed. If our homes are bombed, we die. And if we're unable to grow or buy food because of conflict, we starve. After 8 months of war, 4 million children have been pushed into poverty across Eastern Europe and Central Asia. It's estimated that 65,000 Russians and 61,000 Ukrainians have died as a result of the war. In addition, essential food supplies to victims of war, climate-related disasters, and COVID have been badly affected in many locations by the war in Ukraine. The World Food Programme worries that they may now be unable to fulfill the task of feeding all the children suffering from famine everywhere in the world. And the Russian government, having failed in its ambition to win a quick victory, is not ruling out the use of some of its 5,977 nuclear warheads. Father God, we ask for a continued awareness of your presence each day in our lives. Let us truly draw on you every single day for the courage and perseverance we need to combat violence and hatred. Help us to be steadfast in our way of peace. May we learn to accept people all over the world as our brothers and sisters, and help us each day to do some work of peace in your name. Amen.
Amen, and thank you so much for that reflection, Anne. That puts us very much in the right frame of mind for what we're aiming to do this evening. We've had threats We've had threats from President Putin to use nuclear weapons. The UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace has said that military spending will double from its current level to reach 100 billion in 2030, in line with Liz Truss's commitment to increase the armed forces budget to 3% of GDP, although with the instability of our government at the moment, who knows what is to happen next. And the Trident renewal plan will cost an estimated 205 billion. Meanwhile, it's reckoned that more than 15 million people are living in poverty in the UK, and with 1 million of those living in Scotland. The report earlier this month from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation offered no surprises when it found that people here are increasingly fearful for the future and cutting back on the basics of survival. So much money spent on warmongering, so little left for the growing number of people accessing food and fuel banks. And so I would like to introduce Delia Chatoor, who is very concerned about this whole situation. Delia is a retired diplomat for Trinidad and Tobago, though I see no signs of retirement. A lawyer by profession who did some of her studying at University College London and at St Andrews University here in Scotland, Delia specialises in human rights and humanitarian law, diplomacy and conflict resolution. She served at the Trinidad and Tobago Permanent Mission to the UN in New York from 1988 to 96, and was a member of the Foreign Service from 1983 to 2014. She was a delegate with the International Committee of the Red Cross for the English-speaking Caribbean, organising training and dissemination programmes on international law, was a director on the board of the Institute of International Criminal Investigations in The Hague. And today, as well as being a regular contributor to the Trinidad and Tobago Catholic News, writing about international law and international relations and developments at the UN, she certainly keeps me updated and has written for Pax Christi Scotland, our newsletter. She's also a member of the Caribbean Climate Change Network, contributing to the programme development. She brings much expertise on poverty and the bomb to our table this evening. And if you'll bear with me, Delia, I'm going to introduce your PowerPoint with a bit of luck. Okay, so I think to everybody, I would just apologize because we usually have Callum with us and we don't. So you'll have to bear with me, and I hope that that's okay. Delia, over to you.
Good afternoon and good evening to everyone. I bring you warm and fraternal greetings from the other side of the pond in the Caribbean. So to position where I am, let us look at the second slide, which has a geographical description of the Caribbean, and it will lead on to my discussion this evening, because I'll be mentioning Cuba, I'll be mentioning my own country, but to position where we are in terms of small states in this big arena of the international world. But I'll begin by a little introduction. At a debate in the first committee of the General Assembly of the United Nations just a few days ago, the representative of the Holy See, quoting Pope Francis, said, and I quote, "International peace and stability cannot be based on a false sense of security, on the threat of mutual destruction, or total annihilation, or on simply maintaining a balance of power. And when we speak of balance of power, history will have us remember that some 60 years ago, during the period 16th to the 29th of October, 1962, the international community tethered on the brink of nuclear disaster as the Soviet Union and the USA faced off on the Russian deployment of missiles in Cuba. This disaster was averted, but overall, there continued to be concerns on the retention of nuclear weapons by a small group of states. So here we have Cuba, here we have Trinidad and Tobago, and if there was any detonation, you would realize what would have happened to all the small island states on the eastern seaboard of the United States. Let us look at slide 3 and then slide 4. On the 10th of December, 1948, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even though it is not considered a legally binding instrument, it is seen as an authoritative guide on human rights and the law of the United Nations. Of importance is Article 25, which states, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, etc. Catholic social teaching has therefore sought to position the church, and one may add the Christian fraternity, to address the common good, with a preferential option for the poor and human rights. In other words, colleagues, we are called upon to transform our world into that of the kingdom of God, so that there be the care of the poor and the marginalized. That is our most vulnerable. Unfortunately, we are witnesses to increased numbers of those who barely maintain the decent standard of living as described by various international and regional organizations and civil society. The Catechism of the Catholic Church in paragraph 2443 succinctly sums up what should be our approach and what our policy should reflect, and that is, God blesses those who come to the aid of the poor and rebukes those who turn away from them. Slide 5, which is the next slide, provides a very brief background on international efforts to address nuclear disarmament. And one can look at shortly after the detonations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Once the United Nations was formally adopted as an international organization, there have been numerous attempts to deal with the whole issue of nuclear weapons. And this brief chart brings us down to our latest attempt in 2021 with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. In his annual report on the work of the United Nations, the Secretary General reminded that the organization served, and I quote, as a platform for international cooperation and solidarity, and convened stakeholders and drove global advocacy and cooperation to, among other things, reduce poverty. The Secretary General further reminded that disarmament matters continued to be the key to the work of the UN, and informed that, and I quote again, military spending rose to $2.1 trillion, the highest level since the end of the Cold War. Note that it was not billions, but trillions. Does this make moral, ethical, or humanitarian sense? How can this compare to a record of only US $20.25 billion that was raised to support over 107 million people affected by the myriad challenges, which included the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic, new and ongoing conflicts, natural disasters, and the impact of climate change? Slide 6, please. This then brings us to the issue of wealthy states, as well as those who divert billions of dollars to all forms of armaments, where money is being spent on research, development, deployment, and increasingly modernization of conventional and nuclear weapons. With specific reference to nuclear weapons, many delegates at the recently concluded 10th Review Conference of the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT, made it abundantly clear that the mere existence of such weapons poses major risks to human security, including individual and collective health, well-being, environmental and food security, as well as threats to our climate. In a report developed by another NGO, World Beyond War, which is involved in disarmament issues, there's the following statement. It would cost about US $30 billion per year to end starvation and hunger around the world. Additionally, it would cost about US $11 billion per year to provide the world with clean water. In its 2021 Global Nuclear Weapons Spending Report, the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons, which recently won the Nobel Peace Prize, stated that US $82.4 billion was spent in 2021 by the 9 nuclear-armed states on their nuclear weapons. This expenditure was undertaken as the COVID-19 pandemic brought havoc to the international community and resulted in increased economic, political, and social disparities. With all the billions spent on nuclear and conventional weapons, the conflict in Ukraine was, however, not averted. Additionally, in its 2021-2022 Human Development Report entitled Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives, Shaping Our Future in a Transforming World, the United Nations Development Programme, UNDP, observed that around the world, people still feel even more insecure. The layers of uncertainty range from the confluence of diseases, wars, environmental disruption, leading to continuing disaster events such as drought, famine, floods, and recently, on my side of the pond, hurricanes. There has also been the unfortunate realization that the Global Human Development Index value has declined for the past 2 years in a row in wake of the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. It is fitting, therefore, that this discussion is being held on October the 17th, which commemorates the International Day for the Eradication of Poverty with the theme, Dignity for All in Practice, the commitment we make together for social justice, peace, and the planet. How can there be any dignity when, for example, as the COVID-19 pandemic ran rampant throughout the world, billions continue to be spent on nuclear weapons and armaments. Ample evidence exists that citizens in both developed and developing countries could not gain access to much needed vaccines, healthcare, regular food supplies, and resources to meet payments for heating. In my country, for example, which is an oil and gas-based economy, the government was forced to dip into its savings, and thank God we had savings, where there was a shutdown of the country, and those funds were used to meet the needs of the most vulnerable in most communities. And the funds were used to provide food hampers, continued free access to health services, laptops for children to enable them to continue their education. These were some initiatives that have continued because the impact is still being felt. But what about countries that were not so blessed? What about the countries that we see on our newscasts that are facing drought, internal armed conflicts, the emergence of other infectious diseases, the continued curtailment of economic activities, and the like? How much was the nuclear weapon states willing to divert from their weapons modernization programs to shore up resources to these countries? It is submitted very little. The previously mentioned ICANN report noted that at least 12 companies received $30.2 billion in new contracts to work on nuclear weapons. These companies in turn spent $117 million lobbying decision makers to spend more on defense. Additional resources were diverted to research and initiation of policy solutions about nuclear weapons. We can refer to paragraph 2136 of the Catechism of the Catholic Church, which reminds, and this is something that we all need to remind ourselves, that the production and sale of arms affect the common good of nations and of the international community. Hence, public authorities have the right and duty to regulate them. How much of that is being done? This is where we, civil society, and members of academia come in, as we are duty-bound to engage the multilateral system and other like-minded civil society bodies to ensure that no one is left behind. Poverty, my friends, is no respecter of international borders, as even in the most developed countries, as we just heard, there are levels comparable to those in the developing South. In these most unsettled times, all of us are urged to be our brothers and sisters' keepers. Finally, we may wish to keep before us the following words from Pope Francis in his message to the president of the first meeting of states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in June 2022. Nuclear weapons are a costly and dangerous liability. They undermine international security. What we are also seeing, and it's a positive sign, is an enhanced feminist approach to disarmament issues. In one recent contribution by the ambassador of Costa Rica to the United Nations, she urged member states, and I quote, to embrace a feminist perspective on the consequences of ever-increasing military spending. Such expenditure, she opined, could be better invested in healthcare, housing, education, sustainable energy, and poverty reduction. Slide 7. the SDGs. The SDGs provide us with the elements so desperately needed to restore some measure of trust and stability in the international order. Unfortunately, global statistics, as compiled by the UN and other international bodies, paint the emerging picture that the forecast for 2022 estimate that 75 million more people than expected prior to the pandemic are expected to live in poverty. How can that be realistic when we have trillions being spent on weapons of mass destruction and on their modernization? As I conclude, we all need to ask ourselves whether the world is any safer with governments holding on to weapons of mass destruction and devoting billions of dollars on their maintenance and development. We cannot forget the role played by a number of well-known multinational corporations in the defense industry and banks, which we may use for our little pennies to deposit, which are actively involved in such expenditure. What can we do as individuals, communities, civil society? Many things, beginning with the hosting of events such as this. We must demonstrate that the needs of millions of people in almost every corner of our world must take priority over armaments and armed conflict. We must be persistent in reminding the states that are party to the NPT that they freely gave a commitment to achieve the global elimination of nuclear weapons. Let us also recall the appeal from Pope Francis, wherein he urged for money to be spent on the establishment of a global fund to put an end to hunger and development in the most impoverished countries, rather than spend those resources on weapons and other military expenditures. Member states of the United Nations every year submit resolutions in the first committee dealing with general and complete disarmament. And there are very lengthy discussions on what could be done. We as civil society owe it to ourselves to urge our governments to put their money where their mouth is and help the poor countries and move away from armaments. UNDP has also recently revealed that the world's poorest countries need immediate debt relief. This could help in the avoidance of even more extreme poverty and give them a chance of dealing with climate change and all the ills that they are constantly facing. We are living in very uncertain or perilous times in so many ways, but we have the solutions within our sights, within our hands, within our hearts. Action must be taken, not tomorrow, not next year, but today. And we, in our own way, must be the standard bearers and so the instruments of peace. I thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you so much, Delia. You have given us so much to think about there, and you've given us so many really shocking figures that we need to take on board. And thank you for suggesting that this sort of meeting is worthwhile. I'd now like to introduce you to Michaela Higgins Sørensen, another woman with very impressive credentials. I think she'll give you a fuller explanation of her current roles, but let me say that we are welcoming her from Europe, from Denmark, although she's a pretty global being half South African, half Danish, and raised in Mozambique. She works with the Gender, Peace and Security Programme of Parliamentarians for Nuclear Nonproliferation and Disarmament. She's a core member of the Youth Fusion team and is doing an internship with the Danish Institute for International Studies in Copenhagen. Michaela will give us the facts about weapons of mass destruction and about poverty, and I'm sure she'll share useful links in the chat. So Michaela, over to you, and I hope that we can gather even more facts and figures from yourself. Michaela.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for your lovely introduction, and also thank you for having me here today. I'm so honored to be on a panel with such distinguished individuals and in the great inspiring company of you all. It's a great way to spend your Monday evening, so I'm happy to see all the faces on the screen. My grandmother was actually born and raised in Scotland, in the heart of Paisley, a town I also had the pleasure of spending half a year in, so I hold bonny Scotland very dear to my heart. And hello to everyone there as well. I hope it's just as rainy as it is here in Copenhagen. So over the course of my studies and all of the work that I've been doing on nuclear disarmament issues, I really have learned so much about the disarmament field. And it is truly a space wherein I see so much potential, but also so many obstacles, as I'm sure we all have seen, especially over the past few months, namely with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So there are 9 main obstacles in particular that I see, but I will get back to them a bit later on. But first, I would like to share with you why today is actually quite an eventful day in the sort of nuclear annual calendar, so to speak. So the 17th of October is the day that a 2-week-long annual military exercise that NATO is carrying out is happening, that they are testing their nuclear deterrence capabilities. So it's called the Steadfast Noon exercises and will involve over 60 planes and fighter jets flying over Northern and Western Europe, including countries such as the UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and Belgium, to strategically plan out nuclear war. And that is specifically what NATO is doing here. It's a simulation that's meant to, think through what would happen if they had to carry out a nuclear war. So all of this is funded by taxpayers' money into military budgets. So in a nutshell, NATO's member states' money is being used to plan for a nuclear war. As well as Russia's, as they are also rumored to be conducting such exercises of their own this week. So the main issue here, alongside planning for a nuclear holocaust, is that the fact that NATO nor Russia have any plans or strategies as to what to do after a bomb has actually been dropped. So again, they are strategically planning how a nuclear war would be carried out in theory, but don't really have any solutions about how to deal with the consequences of that action. And just to be clear, there is no state or country on earth that is capable of dealing with a nuclear war. Even one small, like tactical nuclear weapon would have extreme irreparable consequences that healthcare systems or any sort of emergency responses wouldn't be able to tackle. Which is really quite enough to expose the fallacy that nuclear deterrence is. So it is extremely irresponsible to conduct such exercises at a time like this for multiple reasons. The risk of nuclear escalation is high, and tests like this from the past, such as the Able Archer case that was carried out in 1983, nearly ended in a nuclear war over some mere miscommunications. Especially in times of heightened tensions. So we are already in an economic crisis as well as an energy crisis, but it is clear through these exercises and the sort of threats of nuclear war that there is always enough money and fuel to carry out military activities as opposed to keeping houses warm, feeding people, or giving them their basic human rights. So on that note, I am here to talk about nuclear disarmament and poverty, as well as their other intersections. So I will start off with conceptualizing this a bit for everyone, because it is not talked about enough. The fundamental thing to understand when talking about nuclear disarmament and poverty and their intersections is to talk about money. We all understand money because all of our lives are pretty much governed by it. But most of us do not understand nuclear weapons, which all of our lives are dependent on them not being used. So money and nuclear weapons, two things that impact us all, the former very tangibly and the latter a bit more abstractly. So to provide some more context, the United Kingdom is a nuclear armed state alongside the United States, Russia, France, China, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and most likely Israel, and is part of creating global power imbalances that threaten global security, as well as countries that host nuclear weapons, those being Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Between these countries and other countries that invest in nuclear weapons, various actors and entities pour incredibly large sums of money to keep up their production, modernization, and maintenance of these weapons that are supposedly never to be used. The right word is unfathomable amounts of money, because over the next 10 years, it is estimated that over $1 trillion will be spent on nuclear weapons. Now, I'd like us all to try and comprehend how much $1 trillion is. The first time I heard the term trillion, I had to Google it to gain some perspective, and I read that a trillion is 1 million million and has 12 zeros. So let that sink in. That's 12 whole round zeros. And for most of us, $1 million would be more than we could imagine to see in our bank accounts at any given time. But imagine having $1 million to spend over the course of 10 years. We would never even get through half of that if we lived to be 100 years old. I mean, maybe unless you're Jeff Bezos, who needs a regular yacht to get to his supersized yacht. But jokes aside, I understand that most of you here are from the UK. So I went and researched how much money your government invests in nuclear weapons using your tax money. And I found out that the UK's current nuclear deterrent is provided by for Vanguard class ballistic missile submarines, which house the Trident II D5A missile and associated warhead. The decision to procure Trident, as it's more commonly referred to, was taken in the early 1980s. Spending on the program was largely complete by the time of 1998. And the total acquisition expenditure on the program was £12.52 billion at that time, which equates to approximately £20 billion nowadays from the fiscal year 2021 to 2022. So £20 billion spent on nuclear weapons. And that's not it as well. The annual in-service costs, which also include the cost of the atomic weapons establishment and the nuclear warhead sustainment capability program, basing decommissioning and disposals, are currently estimated at 6% of the defense budget, which is a further $2.8 billion for the 2021-2022 fiscal year, which is quite a lot of money if you are spending that annually. So to sum that up, that is over £20 billion plus an annual fee of £2.8 billion spent on just nuclear weapons. That's not even the whole military budget. So that is a lot of money. And there is also further spending planned ahead. And mind you, this was all spent during a global pandemic, which has also been mentioned here as a sort of contrast, right? When people were very, very desperate just to sort of put food on the table. So nuclear weapons didn't get to funding while frontline nurses were putting their lives on the line and they were also getting pay cuts during that period and working overtime, and the mental health impacts of that period alone would be enough to just traumatize anyone. But in fact, the money was actually invested, there was more money invested in global nuclear weapon expenditure at that time, also on the part of the UK. So amidst a global pandemic, one of the worst ones we've had in centuries, the 9 nuclear armed states spent $72.6 billion on nuclear weapons, which is more than $137,000 per minute. And that isn't even, considering inflation. So this is a lot of money being spent on weapons that are supposedly never to be used. And it's also just proving to everyone that the financial scarcity mentality is not applied to weapons of mass destruction and the larger industrial military complex. Even in an energy crisis, a global pandemic, other economic issues, money is still poured into weapons. So I hope that this can get a few of us thinking about our values and how much the UK government values its weapons and military investments above all else, even human lives. So the UK only has 225 warheads compared to that of Russia and America's 6,000 each. So just think how much money is going into the world's combined approximate 13,000 nuclear weapons. It's a lot of money, $1 trillion over the next 10 years to be exact. So a lot of us can't even imagine that. Our minds aren't designed to even begin to comprehend how much money that is, but it is still being spent to invest in weapons that the nuclear armed states claim that they will not use. We are paying for a symbol of power, that is, until we have to pay with our lives if they are ever used. So now I'd like to just sort of contrast that to some real issues of our time, namely poverty. So I just looked up some of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals facts on poverty from recent years now. And there were some shocking facts that military budgets could, even a fraction of a military budget could, sort of help in ending poverty. So here are some facts. And also, I think a lot of us will be really shocked to hear this, especially after hearing the really inflated military budgets. So to end extreme poverty in 20 years, and this is worldwide, an economist, Jeffrey Sachs, calculated that the total cost per year would be about $175 billion. This represents less than 1% of the combined income of the richest countries in the world. So when you're really comparing that $1 trillion to this small amount, it really is a fraction. And back in the July of 2021, the UN World Food Programme Executive Director also told us that it would take an estimated 40 billion each year to end world hunger by 2030. Next up, more than 700 million people, or 11% of the world's population, still live in extreme poverty and are struggling to fulfill the most basic needs like health, education, and access to water and sanitation, just to name a few of those basic human rights. And this issue is also not one that only affects developing countries. Developed countries are also very much impacted by this. Right now, there are 30 million children growing up in the world's richest countries that are subject to poverty, such as the UK. So when it comes to government expenditure, we all know that there is a finite amount of money and things need to be divided up. So we can imagine this expenditure as a pie, and if we let our governments use up the vast majority of that pie on the industrial military complex, including nuclear weapons expenditure, which they very much currently do, we are leaving less of the pie to spend money on more useful things like ending poverty, combating climate change, achieving gender equality, educating our children for the future, also helping our young adults in these trying times, helping the homeless, investing in better healthcare, working on renewable energy innovations, making better infrastructure, and also funding arts and culture. We can't let militarism keep taking away from us. We can't afford to fight about resources, blaming immigrants for taking away our welfare, while our own governments are doing that all by themselves with their outrageous military expenditure to give us the illusion that it makes us safer. Right now, I have never felt more unsafe, and it's all because of the existence of nuclear weapons and power-hungry, militarized governments and actors. We have been here before, wherein the US poured large sums of money on defense during the Cold War under the Reagan administration, which only heightened the Soviet Union's mistrust of the West, thus escalating tensions. Investing in more militarism and weaponry is not solving our problems or keeping us safe. History has shown that. We are in a far, far worse position now because nuclear armed states, namely the US and Russia, did not disarm after the Cold War. So alternative approaches to security are urgently needed. Moving on, I'd like to share an example to outline the connections between nuclear disarmament and poverty, as well as other issues such as climate change, because they are deeply connected. I spoke to my colleague Liz Truss earlier this year in February, who is currently doing a PhD at the Danish Institute for International Studies as part of their ongoing project called Radiant, which stands for Radioactive Ruins, Security in the Age of the Anthropocene. As part of her PhD, Liz told me about how the nuclear weapons testing and military activities carried out in French Polynesia, namely on the Hao Atoll during the French military occupation from 1966 to 1996, had negative repercussions on their economy and the environment, as well as the population's overall health to this day. When the French military left the Hao Atoll in 1996, they dumped all of their military waste into the main lagoon of the Hao Atoll and have yet to remove the vast majority of it. This is tons of military waste we are speaking about here that has been left to pollute the lagoon, ruin the environment, and threaten the human security of the Hao people. Because of the ruined environment, the tourism industry is non-existent because nobody wants to go to a polluted lagoon, which hinders the economy and exacerbates the already existing poverty. The people's health has been severely impacted with the high rates of thyroid cancer that has no accessible treatments right now. And the food security has also been threatened as there are hardly any fish in the lagoon left to eat. All of this is a direct consequence of military spending. Furthermore, there has been little to no spending on the part of the French government to restore justice to the people of the Hao Atoll as part of the French Polynesian archipelago, to repair the environment or help them out of poverty or provide any support to the people who have suffered from the negative effects of the radioactive substances within their environment or the knock-on economic effects to the society. Moreover, the Hao Atoll is still part of French territory. So while the people of the Hao Atoll have been left behind with little to no resources or support to deal with their problems the French government caused, France has only spent more money on funding their nuclear weapons programs. Therefore, we can see clear links between nuclear disarmament, poverty, climate change, and even colonialism. That is why nuclear disarmament issues are highly intersectional, interdisciplinary, and connected to many other issues around sustainability that all fall under the umbrella of human security. I do apologize for being all doom and gloom right now. We are in pretty trying times, but there have been great strides for all of us within the disarmament space, but also great setbacks. The ongoing invasion of Ukraine by Russia is one major setback to mention, with Russia's nuclear weapons being placed on high alert and Russia blocking any progress of the NPT. However, despite such a dire and dangerous situation we all find ourselves in, I still see glimmers of hope in all the work that people like us are tirelessly doing every day, whether it comes from the top down or the bottom up. It gives me hope that after every setback, we come back stronger and let everyone realize, namely for us here in Europe, to never take our peace for granted. And that's one point I would like to reiterate, taking peace for granted. For the most part, people, or rather youth from my generation in the Western world, live in a world without major conflict for our entire lives. We take peace for granted every day. It is our norm, and a conflict in Europe has been almost unimaginable for us. Suddenly, there is talk of nuclear weapons being used, military spending is at an all-time high, people are dying in our very own neighborhood, and millions of Ukrainians have become refugees overnight. And it has happened also very fast. What has transpired in the past 8 months is almost surreal to many of us youths because it has not existed in our bubble of a reality, and we never thought it would, until now. The one piece we thought that we could rely on, we have taken for granted. And now it is shaking at its very foundations. That's why making connections between peace, poverty, nuclear disarmament, and security is so vital. We must never take our peace for granted. Peace is the foundation of a well-functioning society, and without it, we will achieve nothing. We will never be able to face the challenges that poverty brings about if we do not have peace. This has been demonstrated in impoverished and conflict-ridden countries such as Afghanistan, Yemen, Somalia, South Sudan, Myanmar, Ethiopia, and more. These countries have a total societal breakdown in their conflict regions where people are living in deep poverty without human security. Their basic needs are not being met. They do not have the freedoms that are essential to life. They do not have food, healthcare, reliable water sources, a government that they can trust, economic security, environmental security, personal or community security. Again, many of the things that we in the West are still taking for granted today. That is why I specify that it is in the West that we have taken our peace for granted, because there have been many ongoing conflicts that have killed thousands of people in other regions that many of us have turned a blind eye to, as long as we have our peace. Peace is fragile. Security and safety are fragile. If we do not look after them properly, they will wilt and die. That is why I hope that, if anything, we learn from this Russian invasion of Ukraine here in the West. I hope that we open our eyes to see that various issues such as climate change, poverty, peace, and human security are all deeply interconnected on many levels and in all directions. We cannot look at any issue as a standalone matter that belongs solely to other countries. We cannot leave anyone behind in our approaches towards achieving peace. We need to start investing in peace. So to work towards a conclusion here, currently we invest in weapons that are fundamentally designed to kill people, many en masse. We invest in fossil fuels that are slowly killing our environment and planet, as well as negatively impacting people's health. We invest in making the rich richer and the poor poorer, and we invest in expunging our oceans and nature to near extinction. We invest in the wrong things. We have created a structure of violence that has been so normalized that people have stopped questioning it, unless it is on their very doorstep. And when I say a structure of violence, I mean capitalism and patriarchy that is violent towards people, our planet, and everything designed in it. This system is only made to benefit a few, and not all. So we need to be intersectional in our work and take an ethics of care approach based in human rights that promotes human security for all. Our world is too interconnected to ignore conflicts in other countries. A lack of peace and injustice anywhere is a threat to peace for all. We need to treat peace like a global issue and tackle such matters in conjunction. We need to dismantle the structure of violence and put people, peace, and the planet first. That would be a really great place to start. Lastly, the conflict in Ukraine is an example of a failure of relying primarily on national defense and militarism from all sides, as military victory by either side will not bring about peace. Rather, a negotiated solution which meets the security needs of all sides is a better approach that is way more likely to bring about peace and is possible if we all work together. Thank you everyone for listening and for all the important work that you do. And now I'll leave you with some really useful resources that really highlight this intersection between nuclear disarmament and poverty, especially military expenditure. So I'll refer you to the Move the Nuclear Weapons Money campaign that PNND headed, as well as the Youth Fusion website, and some cool initiatives like Don't Bank on the Bomb, and also Don't Even Start about starting a nuclear war. So I will just pop those in the chat, and then I think we can begin our Q&A session.
That's absolutely right. We can indeed. But first of all, just let me thank you, Michaela. Our minds are racing. The facts and figures are horrific. I'm glad that you gave us a little bit of hope there. I'm very glad that young people are beginning to be aware and involved in these issues, because, as you say, because peace has been with us for so long, we have taken it for granted, and now is the time that we need to think about it so much more seriously, so much more in a much more focused way, and I hope that people will take away the information that you're putting in the chat box as well, and I'll put it into an email that I send out to everyone. It's something that we need to kind of get our heads around. I've got some and forgive me everybody for, have I actually got two on screen now together? Hopefully. Anyway, let's see what we can do. Let me go to the box. Please, if you have any comment or questions, put them there now. We have comment. I think I have that. I seem to have come back. Yeah. Thank you. I'm sorry, I was just trying to get Carmen, to get Rosalind to read out questions, but I seem to have come back. For Delia, from Carmen in Uruguay, she says, your presentation was extraordinary, sound and full of humanity. She says, how do you think could we enhance the role of interreligious dialogue based upon Fratelli Tutti and the recent gathering of faith leaders in Kazakhstan? Could you unmute yourself, Delia? Sorry.
Thank you for the question. And this is something that has been going on for a long time, the whole issue of interreligious dialogue. And this was something that is not new. And if we use as our standard bearer St. Francis of Assisi and the whole issue of peace and wanting to link everyone as instruments of peace, as I mentioned, there needs to be a lot of dissemination. And I think sometimes we do not quite understand the role of interreligious dialogue as well as the link with civil society. We all participate in the United Nations. We all have standing in the United Nations. So my approach is, how can we maximize that role as NGOs, civil society within the UN context? And that is where a lot more of dialogue, forget the rhetoric. We need to get down to the nitty-gritty, and importantly, and what Michaela mentioned is, we have to look at the humanitarian consequences of everything, because that is where disarmament must be understood. And what I suggest is, we need to approach our parliamentarians. We need to get them on board. We need, in small communities, to get our faith leaders to understand what is important, that peace is not for just some, that peace is for all. Because when my neighbor's house is on fire, I need to check to make sure that my own house is not on fire. So if the West wants peace, the West, and this is not just faith-based organizations in the West, not just the church, not just the encyclicals from the different popes over the years, but all must be brought together in a common cause, which is humanity. So I hope that that would help a little, but it's dialogue that is important. And peace is flowing like a river, flowing out from you and me. And without that nexus, we cannot say that we are on a positive road to total and complete disarmament. I hope that would help some way in responding to the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Delia. Michaela, would you like to add to that, that issue of dialogue, whether it's faith-based or otherwise?
Yeah, for sure. I think that definitely I agree with everything that that Delia was saying. And also just to build on it a bit more, I think that, you know, if you look at any sort of, you know, movement that's gone towards disarmament, such as at the end of the Cold War between Reagan and Gorbachev, and also Schutz, you see that it wasn't so much, you know, the policies or the treaties that really pushed the agenda forward, although they really obviously helped and are necessary to act as mechanisms for us to utilize and keep everything sort of more or less in check. But it is really the relationships and the dialogue between people and the strong relationships that are formed that really shape our agenda. We're stronger together, and you know, I think we kind of forget that in all of these, you know, international law mechanisms, it becomes very mechanical and, oh, if we have this treaty, then it's fine, and then we can sit back and relax. But I think we need to keep, you know, not just relying on those structures, but actually, you know, rely on our dialogue and you know, put some more humanity back into it. Because if you look at any sort of nuclear weapon process, like such as these military exercises, I mean, it's so detached from humanity. It's absolutely, it's absurd. All the life is almost sucked out of all of this. I mean, it's really, yeah, mind-boggling. So I think any form of, you know, like coming together, forming communities, finding common ground, even if people, you know, whether it be religious or, you know, in some other kind of framework, such as fitting in the nuclear disarmament agenda into the climate change, you know, movement, because they obviously intersect. So just trying to find these pockets where you can bring your message and, you know, band people together where it makes sense.
Yes, I think obviously Pax Christi Scotland is a faith-based organisation, but we do try, you mentioned earlier, Don't Bank on the Bomb. We work alongside of them. We work with Scottish CND and so on, and many different organisations. And I think that being able to do that gives us more strength, and it helps us to really tackle all of those issues, because as you both said, they're inextricably linked. There are a couple of comments here about crisis of poverty. Anne Dobbing says, you've really given a world view of the crisis of poverty and unequivocal rejection of the priorities of weapons production over support for poor people. And Kwechi Chibansa in Zambia says, poverty is caused by many things, and your explanation gave vital views and solutions which can be used to create peace and stop the spread of violence. And I think that both of those comments really do show that there is that inextricable link between poverty and the amount of money that is spent on weapons and the arms trade. Rosalind says, I've not heard about this NATO exercise on the media, so thank you for making me aware. No journalist seems prepared to link issues of military, especially nuclear spending, and poverty. Do you think this is because the general media, such as BBC and Sky, are too connected with multinational companies, or are there other reasons we're not aware of? She says, it seems the UK values weapons over its own people, and now the UK is trying to stop us protesting against military spending. Michaela, can you say something to that?
Well, it's difficult to say, because obviously the information is not there. It's an impossible question to really pinpoint, but I think it's a combination of many things. I think that the nuclear armed states, or the nuclear weapon states, the UK being one of them, have really, you know, wielded this whole, you know, theory of nuclear deterrence, and nuclear weapons are keeping us safe, and we need nuclear weapons because Russia has nuclear weapons and North Korea has nuclear weapons, and, you know, are we just gonna not have them and be, you know, bombed, and next minute we're going to be speaking Russian, and you don't know what it was like in the Cold War, and all these things. So I think that there's a lot of it's just a thing of, you know, nuclear deterrence and keeping that power of balance has just been so normalized from the Cold War, because that was really where it was born. And I think that, you know, the majority of the people who lived through that obviously are in powerful positions and are making decisions as to what gets published. But I also just think that there might be a little bit of, you know, I know in Denmark, for example, just because I actually have information on this, whenever I've sort of tried to publish something that's slightly suggesting that, oh, nuclear deterrence might not be the way to go, our media's also, well, the ones that are public, like the BBC, they also just very much shy away from that rhetoric. So it is something, any sort of perspective that's, you know, slightly questioning this in the global north, especially, it is shied away from. And I'm not completely sure. I think it's, as I said, a mix of things, but I think the main reason is just because, you know, like people are just so, they've normalized nuclear deterrence and nuclear weapons, and they've just sort of, you know, sat back and, oh, it is what it is. I mean, even when I was having my like lectures at university in like, yeah, what, like 5 years ago, I mean, I was getting fed nuclear deterrence theory as like a legitimate thing. And I was at quite a progressive university. So I think it's just something that is so deeply ingrained in people. It's very hard to break that. So
it's interesting. Jan says that we need to find ways to make people realize that of security, and I'm sure you both agree with that. Delia, I just want to ask you, is the media in your part of the world willing to speak out about nuclear weapons, about the spending on military, or not?
Honestly, no. Because when you look at the map, we are so small that we support anything touching on general and complete disarmament. The Caribbean countries were among the first to sign and ratify the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Not that we have nuclear weapons, but from a strictly humanitarian point of view, because then we are also party to the first nuclear weapons-free zone in the world. We are state party to the Treaty of Tlatelolco. So that binds us, not only legally, but morally, to speak up against weapons of mass destruction. And I think that what we look at is we will never be in a position to produce nuclear weapons. For us, our nuclear weapons are the conventional arms that are coming into our country from the north that are being used for criminal activity. That is the AK-47s, those kinds of arms that are being used by drug traffickers, human traffickers, and so those are our nuclear weapons. And that is what our media will focus on. So while one may submit an article and it will get some airing, it is not something that is the subject of great discussion. We know what our international obligations are, and we are willing to go along with those obligations and lend that legal and moral support. But to say to go beyond that, unless something happens next door to us, and God forbid that that happens. I mean, we came close to the Cuban Missile Crisis because we all thought that we would never see 1963. But there has never been that kind of crisis again. So our media will not really spend that amount of time on looking at it unless you focus on what would be the humanitarian consequences for the world should any form of nuclear device be detonated, and you show the linkages that could happen, that there could be a winter, what they call the nuclear winter, where food supplies would be limited, where there would be total migration of people because of the effects. If you can link that, then maybe our media may come on board, but it's really left up to the state parliamentarians to be more aware, and this is where the role of civil society is playing that particular role through individuals or groups. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's probably the way that the media is operating around the world. Carmen is addressing this one to you, Michaela. Do you think the idea of human security as embedding human rights, equality, sustainable development and others could have a new push, and the various reports and recommendations of the UN Commission bring a real approach to security amidst the current tragedies?
Thank you for your question and also raising that. And I think 100% yes, I think that's the only way to move forward. I think that human security is the approach that we need to take, that is a lot more holistic, a lot more humane, and really looks at the intersections that revolve around the nuclear disarmament case. Because as you know, my talk and Delia's talk also went over, nuclear weapons are very intersectional. If a nuclear bomb is dropped, it impacts humanity. It's a humanitarian issue. And that's from our healthcare. We saw what happened in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. To this day, there are still people, 3 generations down the line who suffer from the health impacts. It's generational. There's also generational trauma, psychological aspects of it. Even if you look through the history of nuclear weapons testing, I mean, it's just inhumane. I mean, even in the UK, there are war veterans and also people in, various island nations, mostly such as Kiribati or like the Hao Atoll, the Marshall Islands, where the testings took place, that didn't even know that they were going to be exposed to nuclear weapon detonations and the testing. They were literally just there as subjects. So it's a humanitarian issue that just really cuts across everything, also our environment. And those are the things that this human security agenda focus on. And it's the only way forward, because nuclear deterrence is a one-dimensional road. It only considers one thing, the survival of the state. That's the only thing it considers. It's completely one-dimensional. It doesn't really have a sustainable end game. It's just all about, okay, the survival of the state at any cost, even though, pretty much everyone in the state might be blown to smithereens, but just this idea and this ideology and nationalism, that's all it is. It's an idea. It's a symbol of power. And I just think that we've seen that it doesn't help anything, whether we're talking about nuclear weapons or any other form of structured violence. So I honestly don't see another way forward.
You're both being thanked profusely by people, but one of the things that is said, Margaret says, thank you for your informative talks, even though the numbers are a bit baffling. And they are baffling, aren't they? They're so huge that it becomes quite difficult to take them on board. Anne says, Michaela, how do you deal with all of these issues on a day-to-day basis? How do you spend your time working for peace in practical terms? And I think we perhaps direct that to both of you. How do you work for peace in practical terms? Because we're all activists. We all need some hints about how we can take up this in practical terms. Michaela?
Yeah, so I think that community is really like the key here. I think with a task and a sort of issue that's so big, you can easily get overwhelmed. So you need to really break it down into bite sizes. So for example, I took my internship with the PNND and sort of, got my start there and my network. And then from then onwards, I found a bunch of really inspiring youths who were engaged with nuclear disarmament issues. And then we sort of rebranded an old youth segment of the Abolition 2000 network, and we really banded together as our support system, where we, just try and act as a network for youths to sort of have a platform to be educated, informed, and connected on nuclear issues, and to also fit in nuclear disarmament into other, other sort of more mainstream issues like gender or climate change or bigger peace movements, or poverty, for example, to really just try and get put the issue in pockets, sort of wherever we can. And I think that is really, really important, to just really try and find your community, and to also just have people to talk to. And I think right now, all of us, whether we're in this movement or not, are extremely afraid. The threat of a nuclear war is, anyone can understand that. So I think that it's just important to check in with yourself, and also, take some small walks. It's not all, the pressure's not all on you, even though sometimes you feel like it might be and you have to act and do something. But it's also very important, like if you need to turn off the news for a day or two, then you need to do that, because it's no use getting run down by, all these overwhelming messages and news and all that. It's okay to sort of shut off for a bit, take a break, and then come back to the table with some new energy. So community, look after yourself, and don't try and bite off the whole head. Just sort of take it in small steps.
Thank you. And Delia, do you have some advice for us as activists?
First, I believe in yourself, to convince yourself that what you're doing is going to make a difference. Even though you are a voice crying in the wilderness, somebody's going to listen to you. But I also agree with Michaela that community building, community sharing will be very, very important to spread the message. Dissemination is so critical for anything that we do. And each one would teach one. And how I got the local Catholic news to look at these disarmament issues was to link it with, example, the impact on poverty, climate change, the destruction of ecosystems, things that we are familiar with that will have an impact on each one of us as a community, as an individual. So that is the linkage that is important. Take away from the politics side of it. Leave that aside. Look at the human factor involved. And also what was useful was to quote the statistics on the amount of money being diverted from social activities into nuclear weapons and armaments. I think that came as a shock to some of our people, but this could have been done, this money could have been used to buy more vaccines for COVID. This could have been helped in the alleviation of poverty. This could have built a few more schools. This could have helped our external debt factor. So it's to make it practical and bring it to the home, make it relevant to your situation. And this is where community structures that are very, very powerful can help in spreading this message and cutting down on the insecurities that we all feel. And it's there, but we can interact with each other. And as I mentioned, events such as these, where we interact on a global level, we can share our experiences, adopt best practices, and just move on with each other and hope for the best. Thank you.
Thank you. And I hope that as we're running out of time, I'm hoping that answers Parasha's question. I'm impressed by the fact that Anne has just sent a request to the Guardian newspaper in the UK to ask them to report on the NATO exercises, with special reference to the money spent by the government in the UK at the time of financial crisis and food and fuel poverty. And she's sent a link from NATO itself. So, you know, these are the kind of things that we can all do. And I think that what we now have to do is just to say thank you so much to all of you for asking those questions and making those comments. Yes, what they've told us is astounding, but what we've got to take on board now is how we move forward. And I thank you all so much for that. I thank you, Delia, Michaela, Anne Dobbing. I thank Rosalind for her help behind the scenes as well. Michaela has put her email in the chat as well as those other emails. So please do take note of those. I'm going to bring us to a close at this point because it is actually running on time. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to do that, and hopefully we're there. And I want to again thank you all so much. There will be the recording on our Facebook page, on our website, and on our YouTube channel. So do have a look for that and share it with your friends, share it with all of your networks, because what has been said tonight is of such value. And if I could just bring us to a close with our Pax Christi Scotland prayer. So if we could just bring ourselves together. Lord God, fill our minds with your wisdom, fill our hearts with your love, and guide our words and actions that we might become the living presence of your peace. Bless our homelands. There are many of us from different countries sharing this evening, that we may witness to your transforming universal call to justice and inspire all that we do for and with your whole human family to protect and nurture all of your creation. Place within us the minds of servants, that we might build and nurture a world without violence in the building of your kingdom of love, justice, and peace. Amen. Again, thank you so much.